Good evening to everyone. My name is Father Daniel Huang. I am a professor here at the Faculty of Missiology, and I am one of the co-organizers of this series of lectures on Fratelli Tutti. Very happy to welcome you all and to thank you for being here. I hope you're in the right aula, because there are many things going on at the same time, and if you are here for the Institute of Psychology, that's over in the other side. Just to a brief word, for this whole semester, the Gregorian University is sponsoring a series of lectures on Fratelli Tutti, a very important message of Pope Francis for our world today. Our hope is that through these lectures, the important message of Pope Francis can be more deeply understood and also disseminated. We have asked different speakers from different centers, faculties, and institutes of the university to present an aspect of Pope Francis's message from the point of view of their disciplines. And last week we began with Cardinal Tagle to give an overview, and tonight we have Father Jerry Whelan. So let me hand over the microphone to our moderator for tonight, Antonio Ballero, who is a doctoral student here at the Gregorian University, and he will be your moderator tonight. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It is a great honor for me to introduce and moderate this meeting. That is part of a series of conferences organized by Pontifical Gregorian University in collaboration with Georgetown University on the latest encyclical of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, All Brothers. And I'm Antonio Ballero. I'm a PhD student at this university. Fratelli Tutti tries to imagine a new order of relationships at political level, at ecclesial level, in a few words, at human level. It is not a coincidence that the encyclical is on fraternity and social friendship. And it's very interesting how this second issue is emerging less in the debate around the text, perhaps because of the potential for rhetoric to which, unlike social friendship, fraternity is subject. The aim of this series of lectures is to frame the encyclical through different theological point of views. So this evening, we'll continue to reflect on the path of hope that Pope Francis has drawn in his text. And we'll do that thanks to Father Gerard K. Whelan. Gerard Whelan is an associate professor in the Theology faculty of the Pontifical Gregorian University and is the director of the Department of Fundamental Theology. He grew up in Dublin, Ireland, and joined the Jesuits after completing an MA in economics in Trinity College in Dublin. As a Jesuit, he lived for 14 years in Africa, teaching theology at Ekima College, the Jesuit School of Theology, and being pastor of a poor parish in Nairobi, Kenya. During this time, he assisted the representative of the Holy See at the United Nations, Nairobi, working especially with UN Habitat, the agency that advises governments on question of shelter. He was missioned to the Gregorian in 2007. Professor Whelan's academic interest has always been related to bringing a methodological depth to the commitment to the service of faith and the promotion of justice that is the mission of Societal Jesus. He has turned to the thought of Bernard Lonergan, author of Method and Theology, to help with this. He completed the doctoral studies in Toronto on the thought of Bernard Lonergan and has since published various books and articles. Among these are Redeeming History, Social Concern in Bernard Lonergan and Robert Doran, published in 2013, and A Discerning Church, Pope Francis, Bernard Lonergan, and A Theological Method for the Future, this in Italian. Professor Whelan is the director of the Lonergan Project at the Gregorian University, and his teaching and research interests include biblical hermeneutics, the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius, and especially integral ecology as outlined in Laudato Si. He is on the organizing team of a conference to be held in the Gregorian in January 2022, transitioning to integral ecology, transdisciplinary approaches for the grounding and implementation of a holistic worldview. Please, Professor.
Thank you, Antonio. Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. I hope I can make myself understood. I know the interpretation service is very good for those who don't speak English. And also I will try not to speak too quickly. You've heard that this is a night when we respond from fundamental theology. So just a word about what is fundamental theology. As the name suggests, it has to do with what you do before you start doing the details of theology. Why do theology in the first place? What are the fundamental questions of revelation, of the response of faith, of the credibility of religion, of the credibility of theology as an academic discipline? These sort of questions we treat. But in my opinion, above all, we treat questions of theological method. How do you do theology? And especially after Vatican II, what does it mean to take the signs of the times seriously? And when we want to communicate the gospel. So it's something complex, a mediation between culture and the significance and role of a religious tradition within that culture. These are the sort of questions that fundamental theology addresses. Now, if that's maybe difficult for some, I can also say that the organizers of the conference, and I'd like to thank Father Danny Wong for his working with me before this talk, asked me to remember that this is an early talk in the series and to remember to introduce the text. Every one of us teachers should know to do that anyway, of course. So there will be 4 steps to this talk. First is an outline of the text itself of the encyclical. And I've just put in somewhat joking terminology. What's old, what's new, and what next, as the 3 subsequent parts. What do I mean by that? What's old, I mean, what is in continuity with what Pope Francis has already written? What's new starts to focus on the particularity of the Fratelli Tutti as distinct from other documents written by Pope Francis. What next? Really, in many ways, I hold off my fundamental theology comments until the last concluding comment, which is to say, how can we help interpret and implement this encyclical? And maybe, because we're an academic institute here, provoke a little bit, some critique of the document, some thoughts of where the church can go next, or where theology can help to clarify and deepen the message of this encyclical. You might be surprised at my last little line there in the slide. Beethoven's late quartets. I have not much training in music, but in high school we had an excellent teacher who introduced us to different composers, including Beethoven. And of course, I loved the great big symphonies of Beethoven. Fifth Symphony was my favorite. But I was able to learn to love the late quartets of Beethoven, which were introduced to me. You'd be surprised that they were from the same author, the same creative mind. They're, instead of big booming symphonies, they're delicate pieces for four instruments. Instead of having the very clear structure of every symphony, they are unpredictable and charming. At the same time, if you know his earlier work, you recognize that there is a reprise of his earlier work in this lighter way and very creative and innovative way. And in fact, Beethoven was deaf and blind as he wrote these and close to death. So there's the poignancy and the exquisite beauty of being so creative and yet so nostalgic for the life he has led. I want to use an exaggerated analogy perhaps, but to say that if an encyclical like Laudato Si is the Fifth Symphony of Pope Francis, I look to this Fratelli Tutti as something a bit more like the late quartets. And I hope I'll explain that a little bit as I move on. So, introduction to the text. These are the titles. Let me just go back and forward a bit. So, they don't necessarily reveal so much, but the chapter headings of 8 chapters: Dark Clouds Over a Closed World, A Stranger on the Road, the Good Samaritan, Envisaging and Engendering an Open World, A Heart Open to the Whole World, A Better Kind of Politics, Dialogue and Friendship in Society, Paths of Renewed Encounter, Religions at the Service of Fraternity in Our World. Now, as I've said, that doesn't tell us a great deal at first glance. So let me go back and say a little bit more about the content. And there is inevitably a certain amount of interpretation, a thin interpretation that I'm starting to apply here. Let's look at the name of some of the subheadings in chapter 1. Dark clouds over a closed world. Very negative, you'll notice. I'll be talking later about the method of all of the work of Pope Francis. It is always an inductive method that follows the pastoral circle, so-called, of see, judge, act. So every first chapter has to do with what he sees in the world. But this is especially negative. What a dark title. And look at the headings in the subheadings within the chapter. Shattered dreams, globalizing and progress without a shared roadmap. Globalization, COVID, lack of solidarity in the world, he talks about there. An absence of human dignity on the borders. So he talks about the problem of immigration and the mistreatment of immigrants. And then the lacking a plan for everybody. He talks about the problem of populist politics. And then, finally, the illusion of communication. The consequences of the digital revolution and the apparent increase of communication power, but the actual degradation of authentic communication that is happening in the world. all of that his evaluation of the current situation. Chapter 2, much as he did in other encyclicals, such as Laudato Si, he takes one passage from Scripture, and he's anticipating the main argument, which will come later in the encyclical, by an explicitly theological reference from the Bible. In this case, it's from the Good Samaritan. And he's saying, of course, what we need to do in response to the dark clouds is to promote social friendship at every level. And the Good Samaritan, which we all know, is such a beautiful example of that. But now, chapter 3, 4, 5, we begin the main material of the encyclical. It is an exercise in Catholic social teaching, primarily. And we can remember that Catholic social teaching is primarily philosophical and indeed economic and political. It is an effort to speak to people who are not necessarily Christian in promoting the values of the reign of Christ, as we understand it, in a way that can be accepted and cooperated with by others. So the message of social friendship has already been communicated theologically in chapter 2, but really all the rest of the chapters are primarily an example of moving more philosophically on the question and passing through the stages of judge, act in this threefold pastoral circle of see, judge, act. So obviously the theme of social friendship as a response to the problems is something that will be maintained through all these chapters. But let's have a little bit more of a look at the chapter 3. Now, and here the theme of what I was saying about Beethoven's last quartets comes to my mind. He takes some surprising directions in his argument. It's like a minor theme coming into a basic musical piece, an unpredictable theme. He could have spoken of many issues in social friendship, and there's a certain jumping around of selecting issues. It's a kind of spiraling reflection that he conducts. So, re-envisaging the social role of property. So, social friendship, if you're locked up in a housing estate which doesn't allow anybody enter or close, and there are guards on the road. I lived this reality at the edges of my parish in Nairobi. Well, that's obviously a problem for social friendship. But he has jumped into something very specific here. Now, it's a traditional teaching in Catholic social teaching, the universal destination of all goods. So he touches on that. And then another heading in chapter 3, the rights of peoples. So he goes straight into immigration and ins and outs of how we mistreat immigrants, how potentially they bring a great wealth to us. Chapter 4, very similar, really. So borders and their limits. So it's quite an extensive treatment of the immigration issue in this encyclical. Then local and universal, another subheading within chapter 4. A theme, well, he's spoken about a lot else, so he's speaking about immigration, kind of universal international issues. And he's saying, look, social friendship begins in a family, is very much involved with civil society, your love of your locality. So social friendship has to have the dimensions of both the local and the universal. Chapter 5, he's becoming more forceful in his step of judge. He's almost moving towards act. What do we need to do? This is a very powerful chapter. I suppose if I had to choose my favorite chapter, this might be it. I'd allow another maybe later chapter as well. But anyway, chapter 5, a better kind of politics. Here he deepens the discussion that he had introduced in chapter 1, which is the problem of populism, populist governments, and the distortion, manipulation of voting populations that's occurring. The Forms of populism and liberalism, the politics we need, another subtitle, the exercise of political love. So what's the right way to do it, given the circumstances in the world today? Chapter 6, continuation, you might say, of the right kind of politics theme, but it's more than just politics. Dialogue and friendship in society. I'll be emphasizing later that this is very typical of Pope Francis. This is not the first time he's spoken about these matters. Social dialogue for a new culture. And then the basis of consensus. Here, I don't want to give spoilers, as they say in English. I don't want to say too much about my later parts, but the basis of consensus is innovative in this encyclical, because he's saying, okay, dialogue, I've always been proposing, and obviously social friendship, culture of encounter, dialogue is important. But what will be the basis of consensus? It has to be truth. Dialogue is not connected to relativism. And we don't just keep dialoguing forever. We converge on the truth. So chapter 7 continues the same theme in many ways. So dialogue and friendship in society is chapter 6. Paths of renewed encounter, chapter 7. I loved this title, and that's a reason why it's in the title of my talk. Starting anew from the truth. So he's actually spoken about it a lot in the previous chapter. I just like the subtitle in the 7th chapter more. So we're dialoguing, but we're starting anew from the truth. But then in this mode of you're never quite sure where he'll go next, we start talking about war and the death penalty. So it's this little minor theme, like in the Beethoven's final quartets. Obviously it's relevant. The renewed encounter, well, that's the opposite to war. And then he moves in death penalty as a warlike attitude in political culture that is opposite to social friendship. Chapter 8, Religions at the Service of Fraternity in Our World. You will have noticed that I mentioned that I showed a photograph of Pope Francis with the Imam from Cairo at the first slide. He brings up again in the final chapter. The final chapter is like a very beautiful finale to this encyclical. So don't be too tired by the time you get to chapter 8, because it's a very important chapter. So I'd actually like to make a couple of quotations. First from the introduction to the whole, if I can organize myself, to the encyclical, and then to say what he takes up in chapter 8. But the point is this: we're talking about dialogue, culture of encounter, as an antidote to the fragmentation of the modern world. In the face of populism and the digital relativism of today, we are saying that dialogue converges on truth. It has a base in the orientation to truth of every individual and heads towards consensus that is based on true values. From saying that philosophically, it's a very small step to say religions will help us to do this. So the role of religion in promoting true value in society. But he's thinking in no small part of the fact that he's been in intense dialogue with the Muslims. If you've heard of the Abu Dhabi agreement with the Imam whose name I've written here, so I'll try to read it. But again, you see, it's on his mind. He's been very committed. He's been practicing what he preaches in the area of dialogue and social friendship, especially with the Muslims. So there are more than Muslims in the world, and he's not talking about those. Again, it's this light tendency to move here and there in this encyclical. But let me just emphasize this Muslim dimension that is at the introduction and the finale of this encyclical. In the preparation of Laudato Si, I had a source of inspiration in my brother Bartholomew, the Orthodox patriarch, who has forcefully spoken about our need to care for creation. In this case, I have felt particularly encouraged by the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayeb, whom I met in Abu Dhabi. And then moving to chapter 8, as I've said. In my fraternal meeting, which I gladly recall with the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayeb, we resolutely declared that religions must never incite war, hateful attitudes, hostility and extremism, nor must they incite violence or the shedding of blood. These tragic realities are the consequence of a deviation from religious teaching. They result from a political manipulation of religions and from the interpretations made by religious groups who in the course of history have taken advantage of the power of religious sentiment in the hearts of men and women. God Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone and does not want his name to be used to terrorize people. So that's the end of this encyclical. So, next section. What's old? I just say that a bit whimsically, but I want to, all too briefly, cover a lot of ground, which is to say that there is a great deal in this encyclical, in its gyrating way, which evokes themes about which Pope Francis has been writing from his youth, not just from earlier stages in his papacy. But at least I want to say this, that Evangelii Gaudium is his first letter, an apostolic exhortation, can be understood as a kind of manifesto for his papacy and is in deep continuity with Fratelli Tutti. The reason I just make this argument this way is that on the basis of arriving at Evangelii Gaudium, I want to talk a little bit about the prehistory of Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, his biography, above all, his influence by a certain kind of theology coming from Argentina, the theology of the people. And I hope you'll see that the themes that are found in Evangelii Gaudium, there are ripresi, there's a reprise in Fratelli Tutti. First of all, this method of see, judge, act runs deep in the history of Pope Francis. In fact, it is central to Vatican II. But what I want to talk about here in this slide is some foundational issues. You see me as a fundamental theologian, I suppose, but it might seem that I'm going rather far from the topic, but I ask you to bear with me. You'll notice at the bottom of this slide, I go back to the 1700s and the Romantic philosopher Gottfried Herder. So, but what I want to do is to really explain the basic intellectual profile of Pope Francis, which you find expressed one more time in Fratelli Tutti. So the theology of the people. The Latin American church, where of course the bishops were present at Vatican II, they loved it, they did not speak much, and immediately after Vatican II they started saying, well, how does Vatican II apply to our context? They were very aware of Gaudium et Spes, again the church in the modern world, that the method of Gaudium et Spes is the same, see, judge, act, the inductive method. But Gaudium et Spes lists a whole series of signs of the times. And to the Latin American mind, there was a lot of Western Europe and North America in the tone of Gaudium et Spes. So if you accept the method of inductive method, if you're in Latin America, you have to ask the question, well, what are the signs of the times in Latin America? So they were united in saying the key sign of the times in Latin America is the cry of the poor. So, following this method, we have to find a way of moving from see to judge to act. How do you analyze the suffering of the poor? It obviously has to do with extreme poverty, extreme inequality of wealth in Latin America, and political oppression and violence of dictatorships. So how do we see that? How do we judge it? And how do we try to act as church? Now, different options were taken in different countries of Latin America. And there was a particular route taken in Argentina, which was different, especially from the others, and would come to prevail, to be accepted by the others, only in 2007 in the Conference of the Bishops of Latin America in Aparecida, Brazil. So there's a long story there, as you can imagine, and I have to go very quickly over it. But basically, a founder of the Theology of the People movement was Lucio Herrera. They say Gera, I think Lucio Gera in Spanish pronunciation, but I'll say Lucio Herrera. In the 1950s, he was sent by his bishop in Argentina to study theology in Europe. He was already thinking about the cry of the poor as the characteristic problem of Latin America and searching for a theology to answer it. He had different options available. A lot of the other theologians from Latin America who were studying doctorates in the same decade chose rather to make a limited use of the thought of Karl Marx, a left-wing sociological approach to analyze poverty. For various reasons, Herrera preferred to appeal to a body of philosophy that was always opposed to the rationalism behind Marxism, as well as the rationalism behind liberalism, neoliberal capitalism. That is to say, romantic philosophy. So, Cardinal Walter Casper is a great interpreter of the influence, in fact, of German romantic philosophy on Vatican II, and then on Lucio Herrera as well. Walter Casper says, the parallels between the romantic teaching of the early Tübingen theologians, these were German theologians, early 1800s, mediating Catholic thought to romantic philosophy. So the romantic teaching of the early Tübingen theologians about the national spirit, which goes back to Johann Gottfried Herder, 1744 to 1803, and the Argentine theology of the people are striking and clearly not accidental. So allow me go all the way back to Gottfried Herder. He's in the late 1700s. He's witnessing the effects of the European Enlightenment on Germany. Germany was not one state then, a lot of small states. In many respects, he does not like what he was seeing. He saw the early stages of industrialization, modernization happening. He saw the princes, the kings, the aristocrats of these states no longer choosing to speak German, speaking instead French and English, invoking the Enlightenment philosophers of France and England as the philosophical cultural justification for introducing a rapid economic change in the German states. Gottfried Herder was appalled, perhaps first and foremost, at this despising of local culture, which he valued so much. And he was part of a movement to rediscover the value of the culture of the German peoples. Hegel was another philosopher. I grew up with Grimm's fairy tales. Have you heard of that in Italy? I don't know whether they translate it as much as in Ireland, England. Grimm's fairy tales. You remember how many of them were in forests with wolves and such like. These are German fairy tales that are part of the cultural legacy of the German peoples. And the assertive reappropriation of that cultural legacy was part of a more wide protest of what would come to be called Romantic philosophy over against the first wave of Enlightenment philosophy, which was primarily rationalist. So what did Romantic philosophers talk about? Well, we all know this, I suppose, to some degree. Much the same thing as Romantic poets and literary figures and artists talked about or painted about. Beauty, culture, community, tradition. So Herder was a political philosopher. He wasn't opposed either to democracy or to the economic changes that were happening, but he insisted that could be no one set of ideas that could be imposed everywhere. So he insisted on a process of participatory dialogue for the German peoples in how their countries were going to modernize. So let me just make this one quotation from Herder. The happiness of one single people, Volk, so we're into this theology of the people, the notion of Volk here, cannot be imposed onto, talked onto, loaded onto the other and every other. The roses for the wreath of freedom must be picked by a people's own hands and grow up happily out of its own needs, out of its own desire and love. So Herrera would develop a theology of the people, which had a lot to do with a preferential option for the poor. So theologians, church officials, more educated people who are not, strictly speaking, poor themselves, in a sense, listening carefully, subordinating themselves to the best interests of the poor, who can be subjects of their own history. They need to be decoded by more educated people, you might say. What are the economic policies, the political proposals that should come from a sympathy with the poor? Well, the poor won't always be the best at articulating that. But you must sincerely feel that you are allying themselves to their cause, and they are the subject of their own transformation. Now, in Latin America, we have a Catholic society, and the culture of the poor is intimately connected with popular religion, popular religiosity. So there's a whole approach of theology of the people, respecting popular religiosity, and then moving towards an effort at social transformation as part of evangelization. The contrast here was with Marxism and with theologians who were in the 1950s developing in parallel with Herrera an analysis of the social context that was using sociological instruments that were much more Marxist. This was an analysis of class conflict, class oppression. So they would then, was there a tendency towards violence? But above all, what offended Lucio Herrera, just like Gottfried Herder 200 years earlier, was that they were instrumentalizing the poor. They knew what was best for the poor. Indeed, a Jesuit theologian, John Luis Segundo, was highly critical of Herrera, called his theology of the people verbal terrorism, because he said, we all know the people doesn't exist. The oppressed working class exists. And their culture is that of the false consciousness of the ruling class. That is the Marxist kind of analysis. So you see the difference. The sharp distinction really was with a Marxist influenced liberation theology and an approach to social transformation in the light of Gaudium et Spes that is more influenced by Romantic philosophy. Okay, I have to try to pull myself out of part two. We're still only in part two of this talk. But I have to mention one more thing about Bergoglio. First of all, he was ordained in 1969, 4 years after the council. His teachers included Herrera, Lucio Herrera. In fact, there was especially a Jesuit member of the school around Herrera called Scannone, Juan Carlos Scannone, who was the great influence for the theology of the people. But in Bergoglio's theology studies, he was offered theology of the people. He liked it, he agreed with it, he stayed with it for life. But one more point of importance. Bergoglio was deeply affected by the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Obviously, it had helped him enormously as a novice, but from the earliest stage, his greatest desire really was to communicate the spiritual exercises to other people. But as a theologian, and then he was novice master before being made provincial of the Jesuits, but as a theologian, he made a simple connection, but a profound connection. If Gottfried Herder talks about listening to the people, if Herrera talks about this theology of the people, listening, they are the subject, there's a very close connection, an easy connection with the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and the notion of discernment of spirits. So you discern what is the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful that is at work in the voice of the poor, as the church moves to policy making. So I now have to start jumping along. I've already said that in the long run, by the time we get to 2007, there's an intense history of liberation theology, Pope John Paul II, the journey of the development of post-conciliar theology in Latin America. But during the time of Pope Benedict, there was a very significant Council of all the Bishops of Latin America in Selam. That's a Selam conference in Aparecida. And they essentially adopted the perspective of Lucio Herrera. And there was a drafting committee for the final document that they all agreed to. 3 people on the committee. Jorge Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, was the chairman of that drafting committee. If you look at the document and you compare it to Evangelii Gaudium, it's astonishingly close. We're talking about just a few years apart. We're talking about the same author. So if you understand theology of the people and the vision, the Ignatian addition to that, then you've understood a great deal about Pope Francis, and you know how to read Evangelii Gaudium. I've run behind in my slides, so you see I've already talked about that. Sorry for not staying up to date. Ignatian Spirituality, Selam, Evangelii Gaudium. Very briefly, if the Evangelii Gaudium is a manifesto for a papacy, the other documents of Pope Francis carry out this manifesto. There's quite a consistency. There's a plan unfolding. Just like Cardinal Sunens was a great visionary within Vatican II, he introduced the term, the mission of the Church. It has 2 sides, the mission ad intra, the mission ad extra. Mission ad intra, Lumen Gentium, that constitution in Vatican II. Mission ad extra, Gaudium et Spes. So you can understand Pope Francis's product in terms of working both on the mission of the Church ad intra and the mission of the Church ad extra. So ad intra, amoris laetitia, the family sexuality, and then the move towards a synodal church, obviously that's ad intra. Ad extra, his 5th symphony, Laudato Si. I've already explained that I'm very committed to promoting this encyclical. And also Fratelli Tutti, which is in the same line of Catholic social teaching. links between Fratelli Tutti and Evangelii Gaudium. I've already mentioned ad nauseum, perhaps, the method of see, judge, act. I don't have the time to quote now the course stages from the quotations from the Fratelli Tutti at length, but let's just have a quick look at these quotations. So I'm actually in chapter 5 now. This is still what is old. Maybe you'll recognize from what I've been saying echoes of Theology of the People, echoes of Gottfried Herder, in fact. In a subtitle called The Benefits and Limits of Liberal Approaches, Liberalism. He's been criticizing that since forever. The concept of a people which naturally entails a positive view of community and cultural bonds is usually rejected by individualistic liberal approaches, which view society as merely the sum of coexisting interests. One speaks of respect for freedom, but without roots in a shared narrative. In certain contexts, those who defend the rights of the most vulnerable members of society tend to be criticized as populists. So I could go on, but just to remember, though, the big proposal of Lucio Herrera and of Bergoglio of Evangelii Gaudium is, what is the solution for social problems? It is processes of dialogue. It's almost like he avoids to give a clear answer, because clear answers are killing us. The clear answer of Marxism does us no good. The clear answer for everything of neoliberal individualistic self-interest does us no good. So the process of dialogue and reflection on problems and solutions is a main conclusion of Theology of the People, the main proposal of Pope Francis. We see it in Evangelii Gaudium, the last chapter. He lists all the forms of dialogue that are needed. They will include dialogue between the church and sciences, between the church and political leaders, but they of course involve dialogue between the poor and policymakers, the poor and economists who are deciding about the lives of the poor. So it's a dialogue option. Really, I'm still on the point of what's old in Fratelli Tutti. Social friendship has been the proposal of Bergoglio ever since he first studied Lucio Herrera. Social friendship, dialogue, culture of encounter is the central conclusion of Evangelii Gaudium. So I return to this notion of the Fratelli Tutti, like the final quartets of Beethoven, a reprise of themes that are already intimately close to his heart and much treated in earlier works. So part 3, what's new? I want to make a distinction about using the same method and producing some new conclusions, and pushing the envelope of the method itself that he's been using. I'll explain what I mean, but to start with, I want to say, within the same inductive method of see, judge, act, what's new about Fratelli Tutti? Well, the situation in the year 2021 is different than before. So see always sees new cultural realities. So theology has to be redone on a regular basis, because there's this constant circularity of see, judge, act. So let me just move back, if I may, for a moment to Laudato Si. Pope Francis already did this with Laudato Si. He is a creative, inductive thinker. Doesn't just repeat what he or anybody else said in the past. he is constantly using the tools of discernment, of option for the poor and listening to what the poor have to say and what they feel, to reevaluate situations. So, in all honesty, before being Pope, Bergoglio did not speak much about the environment, about ecology. He spoke a great deal about the poor and about political economic policies that should serve them. But as Pope, he has a global responsibility. He conducts his inductive process, and he recognizes that the key sign of the times is the ecological crisis. Now, I should qualify what I just said, because in Aparecida, he was drafting the document, which had the voice of the bishops of the Amazon present. So the question of the Amazon was already, he was alerted to when he was involved with Selam. But basically, we see the ongoing creativity of Pope Francis already in Laudato Si. So what's new about the Fratelli Tutti, in many ways, it's the new global context. I found it very striking and very true, very sad, how pessimistic Chapter 1 is about the state of the world. Let's remember that basically Pope Francis is a deeply optimistic person and believes in transforming the world. We're not pessimistic in the sense of condemning everything modern and waiting to go to heaven, by no means. But I think this is probably the most negative analysis of current culture and situation that Bergoglio has ever written, is Chapter 1 of Fratelli Tutti. And once again, we see these major characteristics. Relativism, connected with the digital media, and populist politics. The judge, what new is he doing in terms of judge? He's saying, recognizing political philosophy, international relations, migration, political processes of reconciliation, war and peace. These are new themes, but connected to what he considers to be relevant to this more dark situation that he's been talking about. This is my last slide of the third part. What I want to get at here is that romantic philosophy gets you so far and not further. In this eternal debate between rationalism and romanticism that started already in the 1700s and never goes away, there are problems with both sides of the argument. Now, I'm speaking almost like in my final point as fundamental theologian. But if we look to the past of Bergoglio, before he was Pope, we see that these were the years of the Cold War. He had three major ideological opponents who were too certain about things. So romantic philosophy was a nice deconstruction of ideological rationalistic certainties. There was the certainty of Marxism, the certainty of neoliberal economics and politics, and something that he only lets become very explicit as Pope, the over-certainty of centralizing clericalist church policies and a deductivist theology, which doesn't allow subsidiarity and doesn't allow the local churches to do what Lucio Herrera would like them to do. So I am going so far as to say a third ideology that he felt he was confronting in his life was internal to the Catholic Church. But where is he now? This is the dramatic difference of the world we have today. It's extremely post-Cold War. I have a friend, a Jesuit in the Philippines, who has a life commitment to the ecological challenge. And he said rhetorically on a Zoom meeting the other day, the Philippines does not have an ecology problem, it has a truth problem. Because the nature of political discourse is so degraded now that neither debate about ecology nor anything else can be conducted in a rational manner. So what I want to say is that we see Pope Francis even developing philosophically in this encyclical. I don't have the time to quote it in detail, but in chapter 7 especially, remember, starting anew from the truth, this is why I mentioned it in my title of this talk. He is saying, I acknowledge people can call me a populist, so I've got to make clear how is my position, based on romantic philosophy, not the same as the populist politicians that we're all familiar with. And let us think not only of America, the populism, the exaggerated, harmful leadership is present in so many countries in the world at present. So, first of all, Pope Francis will say the people is a mythic category. To be part of a people is to be part of a shared identity arising from social and cultural bonds. Popular leaders, in the best sense, are those capable of interpreting the feelings and cultural dynamics of a people and finding appropriate policy measures in the context of listening in this way. This is to be distinguished from a negative notion of populism. Closed populist groups distort the word people, since they are not talking about a true people. Another sign of decline of popular leadership is a concern for short-term advantage, because this can degenerate into an unhealthy populism when individuals are able to exploit and politically a people's culture under whatever ideological banner. So let me exaggerate, it's like he's on the defensive. It's not as easy for him anymore. It was easier when he was criticizing Cold War ideologies. But now he's got populist and relativist people around him who are saying, no, we represent the poor, the movement from below. But they do so in a way that Ignatian discernment would say comes out of desolation rather than consolation. They abuse this principle. But nevertheless, I want to say that a theology that relies too much on romantic philosophy is going to have a certain weakness in distinguishing itself and challenging the kind of relativism and manipulative populism that exists today. So Pope Francis implicitly recognizes this. So let's just have a look at some of the moves he says about truth. The solution is not relativism. Under the guise of tolerance, relativism ultimately leaves the interpretation of moral values to those in power. When the culture is itself corrupt, the objective truth and universally valid principles are no longer upheld. If something always serves the good functioning of society, is it not because lying beyond it, there is an enduring truth accessible to the intellect? Inherent in the nature of human beings and society, there exists a certain basic structure to support our development and survival. This is an orientation to truth. Now, this is new. You don't find this in Lucio Herrera. You don't find this in Gottfried Herder. Of course, you find it in Pope Benedict, in Pope John Paul II, and indeed, in these last chapters of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis quotes Benedict and John Paul more than usual, more than before. But notice that he doesn't want to go too far to a sort of dogmatism, the kind of invoking of truth that was not open to inductive process in theology. So now it's almost like he's qualifying himself. He wants to relate to his old self with this comment. This does not result in an ethical rigidity, nor does it lead to the imposition of any one moral system. Since fundamental and universally valid moral principles can be embodied in different practical rules, Thus, room for dialogue will always exist. So he still is talking about social friendship, a dialogue process. The insights come caminando. They come in the process. You don't come in with ready-made ideas. But in this relativistic, degraded culture that we increasingly witness, you have to qualify this option for dialogue with some reference to an orientation to truth, which will be fundamental. And let me repeat, he goes straight into a chapter about religion. I think this is a beautiful, harmonious finish to Fratelli Tutti. He's saying, look, dialogue and truth and truthful values are the business of religion in society, not just Christianity. They are a profound basis. It's a major opportunity for renewed cooperation between the religions, who are giving an example of dialogue between themselves, but engaging with society, trying to mediate something more authentic, social friendship as the basis of political order. What next? My conclusion. I've already infiltrated, I've already introduced my fundamental theology conclusions in the way I have been interpreting my first 3 points. The importance of method, open-minded thinking. The relationship between dialogue and truth needs more reflection. Not necessarily by Pope Francis, by us, philosophically, theologically. There are still aspects to be worked out about dialogue, truth, romantic values, rationalist values. There's truth on both sides. We need a coherent philosophical approach in Catholic thought that perhaps we don't quite have yet. This will be relevant for synodality. How does open consultation converge on some kind of truthful expression of the will of the Holy Spirit that will produce consensus and joint action in consolation by the Church, rather than division and rancor? And we have some examples, I won't name countries, but already it's evident that lots of people resist any notion of synodality. Others embrace it in a way that leads to division and a divergence from Catholic coherence, from a rootedness in the sensus fidelium, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of Pope Francis. So I conclude with this point. Let's remember there is this phenomenon of reaction, negative resistance to Pope Francis. I mean, we could give another talk on that. How this has never happened before. I believe it has a lot to do with this inductive method of Pope Francis that is an authentic inheritance of Vatican II, and which many people in the Church still have not accepted. But I want to say there's some truth. I want to phrase this carefully, except I'm not wont to be very careful in my expression, but to recognize in the conservative reaction to Pope Francis, perhaps a kernel of a valid objection that this inductive approach needs to clarify what it's saying about truth, about the more doctrinal. How is doctrinal orthodoxy integrated with the listening disposition of a synodal process? Are we quite articulating that correctly yet? I don't think so. So my conclusion is simply we need to help the project of Pope Francis in places like the Gregorian, because there are intellectual dimensions of his project which need deepening. And I believe, I hope, that such a deepening could reconcile more conservative voices to this project. And I would hope, for example, that they're happy to see this emphasis on dialogue and truth arriving in Fratelli Tutti at last. So thank you very much, and I hope we've done justice tonight to explaining the beauty and the value of this encyclical, which, as I've said, I liken to Beethoven's late quartets. It is a remarkable combination of a reprise of what Pope Francis has already said and an example of his astonishing creativity of an ongoing evaluation and response to the world as it changes. Thank you.